Anastasia Koroleva, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Hello, John. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. 4 exits, 1 9-figure giant exit. And I'm really fascinated by what makes a successful transition for life after the exit. So we're going to do this in 2 parts, as we were talking about before we hit record. First part of this section, I want to really talk about your own personal journey and how you kind of navigated life after your various exits. And then you've also got a tremendous podcast called Exit Paradox, where you just explore this conversation with owners about what they need to think about as it relates to their psychological happiness and readiness to exit their business. So I'm really excited to dive in with you.
Thank you. Thank you. Me too. Very excited. Been a fan of your show for a while, so very flattered that you asked me for this interview.
Oh, that's very kind. Well, I mean, you fit the bill perfectly as a guest as well as an expert. So let's talk about your world as a guest, an entrepreneur who built had a 9-figure exit at Intermedia. What was life like for you after that exit? How would you describe it?
Well, the timing was quite tricky for me. That business we had together with my first husband, and we just had 2 children, one after another. So I was very much focused on learning to be a mother. I also, at that time, already had my second company, which we started while we still had Intermedia. And that company had 7 patent lawsuits in different countries in the world going all at the same time. And we were selling, having our first exit at Intermedia. So the timing was quite challenging. And frankly, I was very distracted in the beginning from enjoying it or even processing the experience because I was so overwhelmed. And also, my husband at the time and I had a very different reaction to that experience. Possibly because I was also dealing with this very new motherhood for me in a different way that he dealt with his fatherhood. And unfortunately, our marriage actually didn't survive that whole roller coaster. And it took me years to understand that that exit was a big part of us not staying together. And I basically think that I probably made every single possible mistake anybody can make after an exit. And my excuse is that I had so much going on all at the same time. And unfortunately, the marriage was also a victim of that. I have since remarried and I have another child, so it's all good. But looking back, I can see how certain things could have been avoided. A lot of suffering could have been avoided. And that's part of the reason I'm so fascinated by the whole challenge, psychological challenge of a post-exit journey.
It's an interesting conundrum, and maybe this is why you refer your podcast as the Exit Paradox, because the very skills that allow an entrepreneur to create a 7, 8, 9-figure business, drive, obsession, focus, are what you almost need to, from what your research says, like have a complete reprogramming of some of those attributes, personality attributes, from being ultimately selfish. Like a lot of entrepreneurs, like, let's be honest, there is a selfish streak to them, right? They are, I am going to achieve this. I'm going to hit this milestone or that milestone, and I'm going to be successful, damn it. And at the end of the day, what I'm hearing you say is that the very personality attributes that have made them successful are the ones that are most troubling in their post-exit life.
Well, but they don't have to be. The reason I use this term exit paradox is because I think there are actually 2 paradoxes in a business exit. And we're talking about life-changing, successful exits, just to simplify things. So the first paradox is that usually our exit, no matter how financially rewarding it is, does not meet our expectations, because the expectation, consciously or subconsciously, is usually that life will become better and simpler. And it just doesn't. It becomes harder. We face new challenges, which we do not necessarily want to have. Like, for example, learning to become an investor, which is something that lots of value creators absolutely hate. And the stress of dealing with this, and the stress that our relationships going through. So there are all these challenges.
But Anastasia, a lot of our listeners are like getting out their little mini violin right now and saying, "Oh, boohoo! Must be really hard to have to learn how to invest all your millions." Most of our listeners haven't had that big, 9-figure exit moment, and so for them, that probably sounds like 1% problems, or
But it totally is. It totally is, absolutely. But I'm just thinking, for someone who is dreaming about getting there, right? And I understand that the majority of your audience would be in that category. They either already expect it, or they're dreaming about it, and they're inspired by it. It's extremely important to understand both the good things and bad things about it. But if you don't mind, I think you'll probably realize that I'm not just bragging about the first world problems. Where this changes dramatically is actually the second part of this paradox. So the first part of the paradox is that we don't want to admit it to anybody, but we are not as happy as we thought we would be. And there are millions of things that wealth solves for us, millions of problems that wealth solves for us. It's absolutely great. It's important. I think it definitely makes people happy, and no question about it. But the second part of the paradox is, I think, the one that is not widely understood. And that paradox is that very challenge of dealing with disappointment, in a way, is a shortcut for that deeply fulfilling and meaningful life that people do crave once finances is no longer the top priority. So what happens is that I like to use Maslow pyramid as a tool, just because there's no need creating any more tools or fancy abbreviations. Everybody's familiar with it. But I think it's extremely, extremely helpful tool to think about during exit. So when we are building our business, what we're doing essentially, we're building up our Maslow pyramid. We're creating the world where each of our needs is satisfied by our business. So we get security from our business, we get self-esteem, we get love and belonging from our partners and employees. It's usually a bit of an illusion, because they don't necessarily love you as much as as you think. You only realize that after you sell a company. But nevertheless, your need is satisfied. And then, of course, we are self-actualizing at a very intense speed when we're building a company. So for somebody who built something very successful, it means by definition that they built a very successful Maslow pyramid for themselves. So when we sell the business, the whole thing is destroyed, right? And that's very important, because we don't expect that to happen. And money cannot automatically compensate for it. What we need to do is to use that money and use the time and use the skill to rebuild that pyramid. And it's not straightforward. It's not that easy. And no one actually takes us by the hand and helps us. So even those of us who go through therapy or hire amazing coaches very quickly run into the problem that selling a business as an experience is very similar to having children or maybe having sex for the first time. Nobody can relate to it unless they actually went through it. It's so unique. It's so different from anything else. So there are not many people out there, even if they are psychologists or amazing coaches, who can help you rebuild that pyramid in a way that suits your unique experience and personality. But if you have this sort of simple idea that I need to rebuild it from ground up, that's probably the simplest guidance you can have. But I think it's extremely important to not kind of to think about one less known part of that whole Maslow hierarchy theory. And that is that we start craving the next level of kind of things in that pyramid when the previous level is sufficiently satisfied. So that word sufficiently is extremely important because we need to master our motivation. So again, going back to how that is the second part of the exit paradox, is that if we understand those kind of simple things in a way that are not simple to execute, but simple concepts, and we start rebuilding that pyramid properly, and we not shying away from things like, purpose and meaning and spirituality, we really open our hearts to those ideas, then there is a shortcut, basically, that our exit creates for us by giving us this time and wealth and skills all together at the same time to jump to that much more fulfilling, meaningful life and rebuild it relatively quickly and have an amazing life. So basically, if I compare people who are successful post-exit to those who are often even unhappier, this is the difference.
It's interesting because there's some people listening to this saying, wow, like I built my beautiful Maslow's hierarchy of needs. My business does provide security and fulfillment and self-esteem and connection and purpose. And why on earth would I ever sell it now? You've just given me like the most incredible advertisement for not selling your company. Yeah. Is that what you hope, that people don't sell and they
not necessarily, but I keep challenging my friends who are trying to sell the company again and again and again to make sure they fully understand what they are doing. Because you're totally right. Lots of businesses. Actually, yesterday I had a conversation with a friend of mine who is trying to sell a company that is a cash cow, and it's an amazing cash cow. And I really had to restrain myself to talk him out of it because I try not to do that. But I was trying to scare him with all the different stories of people who sold this kind of companies, just to realize that there is not only this whole emotional challenge that we're just talking about, but also a very pragmatic challenge of how difficult it is to create something you control and it creates a cash flow at the same time. It's actually very, very hard. People have romanticized this idea of passive income. But passive income, is usually not very passive if it's good income. And second, it's actually very, very hard to create growth and cash flows we're used to in our businesses, usually by the time we sell them post-exit. But I don't think I succeeded yesterday because he just wants that sale.
Well, okay, let me kind of flip it on its ear and sort of argue the other case, which is, I think a lot of founders, sometimes 7, sometimes 10 years in, their business no longer satiates their need for purpose, their need for connectivity. Like it grows to a point where they don't enjoy it anymore. Mm-hmm. Like they're not doing the things that they love. It's not giving them the same purpose. Mm-hmm. So I was being facetious and saying, why would anybody sell a little bit, but just try to draw you into the debate a bit. But the reality is, I think a lot of entrepreneurs do reach a point where the business is just no longer, yes, it could be more successful. Yes, I could continue to grow for the next 10, 20, 30 years, but it won't make me happy because I'm not doing the things that I love. And that seems like the time that they need to step off their current pyramid and start to recreate their next pyramid. Yeah. Is that kind of the case you'd make?
Well, it's great that we are talking about this, because I think there may be great reasons not to sell, but there are also great reasons to sell.
What are they?
So, for example, what you just mentioned, if you're not happy and you're not interested in this business anymore, and you cannot fully delegate it, right? Then selling the business may be a very good idea. Also, if you understand at least generally that you will be losing your Maslow pyramid, you will have to rebuild it, but you're very excited about it because actually that's exactly what you want. Because as I said, I think it's a shortcut to a much more fulfilling life. If you're ready to put in the work required on yourself, it's a beautiful reason to sell. So I wouldn't say that there is ever a yes or no sort of answer for everyone. But I would always encourage people to really think through their own situation and make sure you know what you're trying to do. I also think there are 3 things that I would try to do before an exit or very, very soon after. So one is to change your mindset. And at least to start working on it, because changing a mindset is quite an exercise, but to at least, start thinking about a different mindset, preparing yourself. And that mindset should be very much about giving yourself permission to not know, to be open, and to be very, very kind to yourself. Because an extremely important thing to do is to give yourself enough time to heal. We are so traumatized at that moment when we sell our business because it's so hard to build one. We've sacrificed so much of our health and mental health and relationships to build the business. So healing is extremely important. And I think the sooner people program themselves that when I sell the business, I heal myself first, the better. And another thing which is also very important and very impactful is starting to build this new social network very, very consciously to include people who have the experience. Because when we sell the business, I always encourage people to join these organizations where they can find that social support. And I regret that I didn't do it soon enough. There are fantastic organizations. There are amazing programs that you can do that are both educational and help you build your network. And they're totally worth your money because they save you a lot of money and time and emotional energy. So that I think is definitely another thing to start doing ahead of time. So there are ways to mitigate the disaster if you have at least some general idea of what to expect.
One of your guests, I think his name was Bill Hodenko. I may be pronouncing his surname incorrectly.
Oh, yeah, Hodenko, yeah.
Yeah. He talked about this idea of achieving closure before you exit.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a really thought-provoking idea, this notion that you could be doing an earnout, you may roll some equity, but at the end of the day, like when the majority shareholder changes and you're no longer the majority owner and in control, it's kind of too late a period to get closure. You kind of have to have closure beforehand. What were your thoughts when you heard him describe that?
I thought it was brilliant. First of all, I admire Bill so much, and he's one of the reasons I really wanted him on my show is because it's very hard to find an exited founder, especially one who had several exits like him, who is also a clinical psychologist and a professor of psychology in a major university. So he definitely has the authority for me and respect, and I listen to everything he says. But I absolutely could relate to what he's saying. The thought I had, I didn't quite debate it with him, but you kind of need to achieve that closure when you're very sure that you're selling the business, right? Because the worst thing that may happen is that you've achieved this closure, but for reasons maybe outside of your control, the sale doesn't happen. And then there is a disconnect between you and your business, and it may be quite a difficult time. So the timing of that closure is very important. Like for example, with Intermedia, we didn't sell it very fast. We actually went through, probably 2.5 years of very tiring sort of attempts to sell. And it's a common story. And if I think back, at what point should I have achieved that closure? You know what I mean?
I do. It's so fascinating. I'd encourage folks to listen back to Mark Zweig's, excuse me, I'm pronouncing his surname incorrectly, episode of Built to Sell Radio, where he says that the hardest 4 years of his life were after a deal fell through to have his business acquired. And he had to sort of pick up the pieces and build for the next 4 years, and then had an exit, but ultimately he characterized those 4 years as one of the hardest. On a separate note, I'm somewhat feeling like in the twilight zone having this conversation, because I've just had a conversation with a guy named Adam Coffey. Adam's episode will be live by the time that our episode goes live, and Adam talks about the private equity playbook. This idea that really, the most successful entrepreneurs sell to private equity, roll some of their proceeds, build the company up as the CEO, sell it a second time, sell it a third time, and all the while they're a minority shareholder, but they're building wealth because the capital of the private equity group, et cetera. And it's so, to use your word, paradoxical for me, because it's such a different. In Adam's case, he thinks of business as, the idea is that we're trying to grow a business as big as possible. And of course you have to give up a bunch of equity to do that, but your job is to build the business as a manager of the business. But what you're saying is that once the founder is no longer in control, like it's a psychological turning point in their mind. Like it's a huge change, right? They jump off this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're at the top of the pyramid. Everything's great. And then they move to a situation where they're building their life up from scratch. But Adam would say, oh, just because you're no longer the majority shareholder, that doesn't mean anything. We grow the business. Even if you own only 10% of it, you got to scale, grow. And he would have this very different view than you do, which is, once you sell, you're going to go through this incredible roller coaster of emotions. You lose your sense of purpose. You lose your identity. And he doesn't see that because he's a private equity guy, right? He sees, he doesn't see what you see. I should, to be fair to Adam, I haven't asked him specifically, but I think, he would not, feel the same way. He would say the purpose of business is to grow it as big as you possibly can. And whether you own the majority of it, a minority of it, a tiny slice of it, that's somewhat irrelevant. The goal is to build. What you're saying is very different. I'd just be curious to know your reaction to that sort of.
Absolutely. I have a very simple reaction to that. It is my observation that successful exited founders belong broadly to one of two groups, creators and investors. And that really is who we are. I don't think it's very easy for creators to be investors. And this is exactly why I think so many angel investors or VCs are unhappy, because they're innately creators. But it's also very hard for an investor to become a builder or creator. And both are equally fantastic, right? And great. And I learned this lesson actually surprisingly from my children, because I have two teenage boys that are very entrepreneurial. And the older one is very successful financially already, even though he's 17. But when you raise children, you really, really know them, right? You've seen them from the time they were born. And my older one is a true investor. He has zero interest in creating or building, but he just sees how to make money and he just goes for it. He's fantastic. And maybe your guest belongs to that category. But then his brother is the opposite. He cannot not create. He has to create all the time. And I can see how he can be very successful doing exactly that, but he'll never be like his brother. And that's great. And I love them both equally. I respect them both equally. And I see exactly the same two groups among successful people, exited founders or not.
Yeah, I love that distinction, investors versus creators. I think you're absolutely right. The creator, my sense is that they lose motivation, they lose interest in their company when they're no longer creating. And that might be at 10 employees or 20 employees or 50 employees, but fairly early in the trajectory of the business's life cycle, they're like, no, thanks. I'm not scratching that itch anymore. Whereas the investor, some of the most financially sophisticated people I know are some of the least creative, to be just totally blunt about it. I mean, that's an oversimplification. I'm sure there's very creative financial people, but in general, the investors I know who are great capital allocators aren't necessarily the best creators. And so I can see why people who are investors enjoy the mature stages of a business and enjoy kind of placing capital in different businesses.
Yeah.
So having the self-awareness to figure out which you are. Is there an acid test, a way? I mean, you've done it with your own kids, but that's taken obviously years. Is there a question you might ask yourself or encourage our listeners to ask themselves to decipher whether they are a creator or an investor?
Well, I think if people are very honest with themselves and they just have to pick one over the other in terms of their priority, whether they care more about what drives them, if they're driven by the idea of playing this game of money making successfully. And I'm not necessarily saying greed, because I think greed can be satisfied, but I see lots of investors just loving the game. And they're doing it for the process, for winning, it's really more like a game thinking. Or they really cannot not create. Because I have amazing friends who are exited founders, and they exited their businesses. They hit this emotional roller coaster. They had all sorts of problems with relationships and everything under the sun. And yet they absolutely had to continue creating, because I think that's what defines these serial builders, right? They have to keep building despite everything. Actually, talking back about Maslow pyramid, I only fully understood the wisdom of his theory when I actually read his books, because what we are taught at school is very superficial. But he has 7 exceptions of types of people who don't actually follow the rules. And these were his observations for his work as a clinical psychologist. And there are 2 exceptions there that, when put together, actually explain a lot in terms of how some post-exit founders behave. So these are people who have so much of this innate creativity, and he calls them creators, that they are so motivated by the creation that they actually don't need all the other needs to be sufficiently satisfied to jump right into self-actualization. And lots of famous artists or musicians are exactly like that. Their lives are a complete mess. And they never spend any time actually dealing with it. History is full of these stories, but they keep creating. They spend all their time. They feel no sufficient pain to address all these other things.
Yeah. It sounds, like Elon Musk could be the classic example of what you're describing, right? So Starlink, Tesla, space, go on and on. Yeah. The boring, you could go on about his, but troubled personal life, lots of kids and lots of situations there. I want to air dirty laundry about Elon Musk, but having read the biography, there's lots of stuff there, and yet he loves to create, right? Like there's always another thing that he wants to create.
And he's perfectly comfortable not being financially safe, right? This is what always surprised people. Like, why did he sleep on a friend's couch when he had just sold his business so successfully? But that's exactly what it is. So when you're asking me, how do you know? I think you know.
Interesting. One of the things that I've heard you talk about as a mistake, and I think it came up in one of your episodes as well, is entrepreneurs, after selling their company, often make the mistake of becoming angel investors. Like they think they've got a gift and they're gonna become angel investors.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that a mistake?
Well, it was a mistake for me, first of all. So I'm not necessarily saying it's a mistake for everyone, but I do hear that a lot, that people go in that direction and then they really, really regret it. And I think that is more typical of value creators, because for example, let me talk about my situation. I think it would be better. So in my case, I thought I was doing angel investing for all the right reasons. So my explanations at the time for myself was, oh my God, I really want to learn more from these amazing people. I want to have all these startup founders, all this energy. I want to be part of the ecosystem. I want to give back, right? Because part of angel investing is usually also mentoring, and I want to give back. I had such a beautiful explanation for what I was doing.
Yeah, it sounds very selfless. It sounds very actualized. It sounds very second pyramid. Yeah.
Years later, when I learned to be honest with myself, I had to face the truth. The real reason I did it was because I wanted to matter. I had this identity crisis, and I was like, "Oh my God, I'm no longer a CEO founder. Who am I? I'm out of this ecosystem. I'm nobody," and I was panicking. I really needed some label. And then again, maybe subconsciously, I'm not even sure, I kind of looked around and like, what others do? What are the cool labels? The cool labels in Silicon Valley would be, angel investing or VC, and everybody is talking about it. And then you hang out with other angel investing. It's kind of social fun. And then what happened was that soon enough, I got bored with it. I got bored with it because I realized that, first of all, I'm much more interested in spending time with the people who already sold the company, their companies, because I can relate to them more. Second, I spend so much time with these people together with the money that is not really fun for me. And as I'm sure you know, time becomes such a much more important currency than money after you exit the business. It's all about time, right? And I became more mindful of that, maybe even greedy of my time. And then the second thing is that the actual analysis of businesses I find totally boring, because I'm not an investor. And this is such a common story. I hear it again and again and again.
So it's common. It's not just your own experience, but you've heard it again and again on the podcast.
I think it's much more common than when people actually enjoy it. And people who enjoy it are usually people whose personality are investors. If you look at their previous businesses were probably either in financial services industry, or they had some kind of training before. For example, they used to work in the financial industry, then they had a company, then they love investing a lot. Or they're also very pragmatic. Like I have some friends who maybe never worked in the financial industry, but they just have this mindset. And they created a business purely because they found a financial opportunity. They pursued. They never cared about the essence of the business very much. They never wanted to create. They were just very good at milking that financial opportunity.
Yeah,
that's the investor type of a personality.
I'm glad you brought up money earlier, because I wanted to dig in here. I know you ask a lot of your guests about money and whether the money that they earn through their sale of their company brings happiness. And I think some of those conversations are interesting. I think a lot of our listeners are yet to have that massive liquidity event. Their business may be worth a lot on paper, but it has not yet been made liquid. And a lot of them, I think, have a financial goal. They're like, I want to be worth $5 million. I want to be worth $10 million. I want to be worth $50 million. Whatever the arbitrary number is, they've got a number, and they're like, yeah, I'm going to sell when it's worth fill in the blank. What advice would you have for someone who is chasing a number?
Well, I interviewed Michael Sonnenfeld, who is the founder of Tiger 21. And he has this very famous 2% rule, which I think answers your question perfectly. And I'm not delusional enough to think I would know better than Michael. And the rule is very simple, that you need to cover your living expenses with 2% of your net worth. So I think this is exactly the exercise that needs to be done for people who want to sell and not worry about money for the rest of their lives. So I'm not talking about Elon Musk's of this world who wouldn't care. I'm talking about the majority of us.
Tiger 21, for those folks who don't know, is like a peer-to-peer organization similar to a YPO or an EO or a Vistage. Yet it's dedicated to folks who have had, usually an entrepreneur who's had a liquidity event. I think it was $10 million US dollars of liquid assets was the minimum. I can't remember if it's changed.
It's 30 now, so it keeps growing.
There you go. But it's a group that meets and has these sort of peer-to-peer discussions about how you're handling money and investing in money. And so Michael, the person Anastasia just referenced, is the founder of that organization. So the 2% rule, interesting.
Yes. So the organization is 25 years old now, and the whole essence of it is sort of accumulating this wisdom and knowledge about investing. Michael is really a great source of this kind of wisdom. Again, doesn't mean you shouldn't sell if you can't afford living on 2%. Probably not. It's very, very conservative. Also, for example, if you're selling with the idea that you're going to build an even bigger business and you actually want to continue value creating, then you can think about it very differently. So it's not the only rule out there. But if you want a rule of thumb, that's probably as good as it gets.
What about people who look for purpose in other areas of their life? So they sell a company and they're adrenaline junkies, they're achievement junkies, they're competitors. And so they flex that muscle by starting a charity, doing some sort of athletic competition, an Ironman, a marathon. They're moving. One might argue there's a case to be made that they're going from one purpose that's driven by achievement to another that is maybe arguably not selfless in your definition, is still achievement oriented. It's just maybe with the goal of achieving something other than building a business.
Yeah.
How would you think about someone who said, look, I want to sell because I've got this other goal I want to go pursue, but it's still another goal that's going to fulfill some part of their ego and their sense of self-worth and so forth. How would you coach someone who is considering that?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's great. There's nothing wrong with it. I also think that you cannot expect yourself to just become selfless over time. That's just bullshit. And I think it's actually a big, big problem, because this is where lots of not authentic giving comes from. I think it's very important to understand where you actually are in that spiritual growth and give yourself time. And when we talked about spiritual fitness, this is, for me, the tool I use for myself, because I'm not a selfless person. I have a lot of selfishness to deal with, and that's okay. I totally embrace it. But I have a system which is very similar to physical fitness. It's basically, I learned a few concepts, and now I incorporated them into my daily routine, and I try to develop these good habits, and I try to become better at it. It's very similar to physical fitness, but it's just, the goal is different, to become less selfish, but in a genuine way, right? And it's definitely working, absolutely working, but it takes time. So I would say if you don't feel selfless, that's perfectly fine. Don't try to be. Don't force it. It's just silly. I also think that after we exit the business, the first thing is healing, right? And that's for me a no decision zone. Like, you cannot commit to anything during that time. You're literally healing. You have to embrace the fact that you are in a way sick because you're traumatized, right? And while you're traumatized, you're going through even more trauma on top of trauma. So healing is very important. But the second stage in an ideal world, and the world is not ideal, but in an ideal world would be exactly that, would be, traveling to exotic destinations in a challenging way, running marathons, pushing yourself. Why? Because this is exactly how we know who we are. Right. And this is how we find out what our true desires, what our talents are. Because sometimes people say, oh, if you want to understand what you truly love, think about your childhood. I don't like that idea because, okay, this may help you find some of your talents and desires, but were you really exposed to things that maybe would have taught you more about who you are? Probably not. So if we have this luxury of time and the money, we may as well go and run our marathons and chase whatever it is we feel like chasing while learning about ourselves.
I loved your interview with Adrian Cohen, and you guys touched briefly on this idea of raising kids after a sale. Of course, these days, when you sell your company, it's not long before the entire world knows you've sold it and kind of starts to piece together the financial impact for you. And of course, your kids see that, right? They see that online. I'd be curious to know how you've chosen to handle it with your kids to ensure, they're not entitled little brats waiting for mom to pass over the keys to the kingdom. As well, what lessons you've learned from some of the interviews that you've done around how to raise kids without a sense of entitlement?
Yeah, this question is very close to my heart. It's probably the hardest nut to crack in the community. And my observation is that there are two schools of thoughts, and I'll tell you what mine is a bit later. One, which I see sort of third-party advisors recommend quite often, is being very open with your children about your wealth and the potential inheritance, bringing them into sort of the family. In fact, one woman who's been just focusing on this issue for 20 years, and she advises wealthy families on this for 20 years. When I asked her directly, I said, how early do you think families should open their books? He said, whenever children can speak. So the earlier, the better. And the second school of thought is very different, which is basically trying to have more modest life for the sake of the children, making it very clear that they cannot rely on inheritance, and trying to instill these values that they should earn their money themselves. So in my case, as I mentioned, my kids were very small when the first exit happened. And also, unfortunately, we had to go through this divorce. So I had to make some decision when I completely wasn't ready. I was too young, too busy. But I made the decision at that time that I will raise my children with the following philosophy: that they're not getting any inheritance. They cannot ever hope for it. They never get any money without earning it with some kind of actions. And I also decided that I'll raise them completely unemployable. I'm not sure I would do it again. I'm not recommending necessarily that anyone does it, but I was young and stupid and brave and overly confident, as I mentioned before. So for whatever reason, I really committed to that. And I started raising them exactly that way, very consistently. Now, fast forward to them being 17 and 15 now. It worked. They're very entrepreneurial. They have there's zero entitlement. I achieved what I wanted to achieve, because it was this entitlement that I really was afraid of. But I did create problems. The biggest problem was that when my older one became completely financially independent at 14, his emotional maturity wasn't there. So imagine a child who basically is so financially independent that there is nothing you can threaten him with that will make him listen to you. So it's very, very scary. And he had to go through his emotional roller coaster, kind of being the only child in his circle with the money. He made all sorts of mistakes. By now, he's absolutely amazing. But I'm praying every single day that he's alive, because it is actually a very dangerous situation for a young person to be in. But again, now that I have a smaller child, I'm looking into this again and again and again. And I'm still not sure that I would raise my youngest one with the idea that he will inherit a lot of money and he should be ready for it. I'm really not there.
It's a real, I mean, like wealth managers, like they have conferences on this. They have all kinds of like, and you're right. I think the wealth managers seem to have this sort of prevailing idea that you need to talk to the kids about it, and that you're very proactively, because they've seen the other side of the horror stories of people, inheriting wealth that they weren't ready to inherit and so forth. So I think I am not a financial advisor. Don't want to play one on the internet, and don't, proclaim to have any expertise. We did something funny. I remember, when I was my kid, I can't remember. My kids were probably 5 and 3 at the time. Or no, sorry, they were older. They were maybe like 9 and 7. And I wanted to teach them about deferred gratification and saving. And so I decided I wanted to get a Chevy Bolt. This at the time was the electric car that Chevy was coming out with. And I thought, like, I'd seen some ad and thought, oh, this is going to be great. And so I went out and bought a giant piggy bank, one of those things, those like plastic containers and I put it on our kitchen table. And I said, guys, this is going to be our Bolt bank, right? We're going to save up for this new car. And every night I would make this big dramatic entrance and I'd put like my coins in my pocket and put it in the bank. And I'd say, how's the bank? Like, all right, where are we, guys? And we'd count it all up. Oh, just not quite there yet. We're going to have to keep saving. And like this whole dramatic thing. And it took years. Eventually I bought this. Anyway, long story short, last year I was having a quiet moment with my oldest, who's 10 years older now, and he said, "Do you remember that whole Bolt Bank thing, Dad?" And I'm like, "Yeah, totally." He's like, "That was just bullshit, right? Like that you were just basically this. That was just some giant life lesson." And I'm like, "Yep, busted."
Yeah, kids are much smarter than we think.
Way smarter. Yeah, way smarter.
But it just reminds me of this gentleman that gave me a very wise advice. He's in his mid-70s, and I asked him a very similar question because I thought he was incredible at raising his children. And by his age, you can see that all the kids are fantastic. And he gave me a piece of advice, which I since am using on a daily basis. He said, it's very, very important to identify the moment when you switch from parenting to mentoring. So for me, this moment was forced on me when my son became financially independent. And I realized, okay, I have no influence whatsoever financially, but maybe I can use this advice and become this indispensable mentor. And this worked so well because now we're extremely close. He wants my opinion, my advice about his financial decisions. And I think it's, again, I don't know if it's easy to replicate, and I'm not necessarily giving any advice to anyone, but my experience shows that this piece of wisdom may be exactly what we need. Instead of opening our books and spoiling our children, we can make sure they really respect our advice and they come for it themselves.
Yeah, well said. And there's so much more to explore. Our time is unfortunately coming up to an end. I'm really grateful for you sharing your wisdom, both from having exited companies yourself, but also from all of the interviews you've done for Exit Paradox. So for folks who are interested, the show is called Exit Paradox. I'd recommend everybody take a listen. And people can find it on obviously the podcasting platforms, YouTube as well. Where else if they want to say hi on social media, what's the best channel to do that, is Anastasia?
Well, I have to say I'm a bit lazy with social media. I should really do more, but I basically post on LinkedIn mostly.
LinkedIn.
And then Twitter. I don't really do anything else. But LinkedIn I quite like.
And we'll put Anastasia's LinkedIn profile in the show notes at builttosell.com. Anastasia, thanks for doing this. It was fun.
John, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. It was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it.